Welcome back to Mindset HubTube. What if the thing you're most afraid of is not actually standing in front of you? What if it is living inside your own mind? Every morning, Nikit woke up with the same strange feeling. Nothing was physically wrong. His room was quiet. The sunlight came through the curtains. His phone was beside his bed. Another ordinary day was waiting for him. And yet, Nikit was afraid. Afraid of making the wrong decision. Afraid of failing. Afraid of disappointing people. Afraid that one day he would look back at his life and realize he had spent most of it avoiding the things that mattered. The strange part was that nobody around him knew. From the outside, Nikit looked calm. But inside his mind, there was a voice that never stopped. What if something goes wrong? What if they judge you? What if you are not ready? What if you fail? And eventually, Nikit discovered something that changed the way he looked at fear forever. Fear does not always come to stop you from danger. Sometimes, fear comes disguised as protection. It tells you to wait. It tells you to stay comfortable. It tells you to think a little longer. It tells you that tomorrow will be better. And before you realize it, tomorrow becomes next month. Next month becomes next year. And one day, you discover that the life you wanted was never lost. You simply kept walking away from it. This is the story of Nikit. A story about fear. Not about eliminating fear, but about understanding it. Because the goal is not to become a person who never feels afraid. The goal is to become the person who can feel fear and still move. Chapter 1. The Voice in the Dark. Nikit had always believed that fear was an enemy. Whenever fear appeared, he tried to escape it. If something made him uncomfortable, he postponed it. If a difficult conversation came closer, he avoided it. If an opportunity required him to step outside his comfort zone, he found reasons to wait. He called it being practical. He called it being careful. He called it thinking things through. But deep inside, he knew the truth. He was afraid. One evening, Nikit sat alone near his window. Rain was falling outside. The city looked different through the glass. Lights blurred across wet roads. People hurried beneath umbrellas. Cars moved slowly through the streets. Nikit watched them and wondered how many people were secretly carrying fears nobody could see. Then his phone rang. It was an old friend. They spoke for a few minutes. During the conversation, his friend asked him a simple question. Are you happy with where your life is going? Nikit smiled. I think so. There was a pause. Then his friend said, You think so? That sentence stayed with him. After the call ended, Nikit looked at his reflection in the dark window. He realized something uncomfortable. He had become very good at explaining why he couldn't do things. But he had become terrible at explaining what he actually wanted. He remembered all the times he had said, I'll do it later. I need more time. I'm not ready. Maybe this isn't the right moment. The excuses sounded reasonable. That was what made them dangerous. Fear rarely arrives wearing a sign that says, I am fear. Sometimes it arrives wearing the clothes of logic. It says, be responsible. Don't take unnecessary risks. Wait until you are completely ready. Think about what people will say. And because those sentences sound intelligent, we obey them. That night, Nikit made a small experiment. He opened a notebook. At the top of the first page, he wrote, What am I actually afraid of? For several minutes, he stared at the blank page. Then he began writing. Failure, judgment, rejection, uncertainty, being misunderstood, losing control, making a mistake, not being good enough. He stopped. Then he noticed something. Most of his fears were not about things happening now. They were about things that might happen later. His mind was creating futures that did not exist yet, and then forcing his body to react as though those futures were already real. Nikit closed the notebook. He suddenly understood why fear could feel so powerful. Fear does not always need evidence. Sometimes imagination is enough. The next morning, Nikit decided to pay attention to his thoughts. He didn't try to fight them. He simply watched. When his mind said something could go wrong, he noticed it. When it said, people might judge you, he noticed it. When it said, you're not ready, he noticed it. And slowly, something strange happened. He began to separate himself from his thoughts. Before that morning, when fear spoke, Nikit believed it. Now he was learning to say, I am having a fearful thought. That sentence seemed small, but it created distance. A thought was no longer a command. A feeling was no longer a fact. Fear was no longer the master. It was information. That afternoon, Nikit deliberately did something uncomfortable. He made a phone call he had been postponing for weeks. His heart beat faster. His palms became slightly sweaty. His mind gave him 10 reasons to cancel. But he pressed the call button. Nothing terrible happened. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. When it ended, Nikit sat quietly. The situation had not been nearly as frightening as his mind had predicted. And that was his first lesson. Fear grows when you constantly obey it. But every time you face a manageable fear, you teach your mind something new. You teach it, I can survive discomfort. That night, Nikit wrote one more sentence in his notebook. Maybe courage is not the absence of fear. Maybe courage begins when I stop letting fear make every decision. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. Because there are fears that disappear when you face them. And there are deeper fears that force you to confront who you really are. And Nikit's next lesson would come from one of those. Chapter 2. The Fear of Being Seen. A few weeks passed. Nikit continued his experiment. Whenever fear appeared, he tried to observe it before obeying it. He started taking small actions. He spoke more honestly. He stopped avoiding certain conversations. He began saying no when something didn't feel right. And for the first time in a long time, he felt that his life was moving. But then something happened. An opportunity appeared. It was not dangerous. It was not impossible. It was simply something that required Nikit to stand in front of other people and express his ideas. The moment he heard about it, excitement appeared. Then fear arrived. What if you embarrass yourself? What if people think your ideas are foolish? What if someone asks a question you can't answer? What if they realize you aren't as capable as they think? Nikit almost rejected the opportunity. Then he remembered his notebook. He wrote, What am I afraid of? The answer came quickly. I'm afraid of being seen. He stared at those words. Being seen. That was different from failure. He realized he wasn't only afraid of making mistakes. He was afraid of what mistakes would say about him. If he failed, perhaps people would think he wasn't capable. If someone disagreed with him, perhaps they would think he wasn't intelligent. If he made a mistake, perhaps they would think he was weak. Suddenly, Nikit understood something about fear that he had never noticed. Sometimes, we don't fear the event itself. We fear the meaning we attach to the event. A mistake becomes, I am a failure. A rejection becomes, I am not worthy. A criticism becomes, I am not good enough. One moment becomes an identity. And once the mind connects an event to identity, fear becomes much stronger. Nikit decided to accept the opportunity. The day arrived. He stood outside the room. His heart was racing. He could hear people talking inside. His body wanted to leave. For a few seconds, he considered walking away. Then he whispered, Let them see me. Not the perfect version. Not the version who had every answer. Just him. He walked inside. The first few minutes were uncomfortable. His voice was slightly tense. His hands were cold. His mind moved faster than his words. Then something unexpected happened. He made a small mistake. For a second, Nikit froze. His old fear screamed, This is it. Everyone noticed. But he continued. Nobody laughed. Nobody stood up. Nobody announced that Nikit had failed as a human being. The world simply continued. Afterward, he stepped outside. He sat on a bench and laughed quietly. Not because everything had gone perfectly. It hadn't. He laughed because his mind had predicted a disaster, and reality had delivered a normal human moment. That evening, Nikit wrote, People are usually not watching me as much as I imagine. It was a powerful realization. Many fears are amplified by the illusion that everyone is constantly evaluating us. But people have their own worries, their own insecurities, their own unfinished conversations, their own fears. Nikit had spent years living as though an invisible audience was watching everything he did. Now he realized the audience existed mostly inside his head. But there was another lesson. He couldn't build courage by constantly waiting to feel confident. Confidence came after action, not before it. Nikit remembered the first phone call he had made. He had been nervous before the call. He wasn't nervous because he lacked courage. He was nervous because the action mattered to him. And that distinction changed everything. Fear was not always evidence that he should stop. Sometimes fear was evidence that he was stepping into unfamiliar territory. So Nikit began changing his question. Instead of asking, "How can I stop being afraid?" he asked, "What would I do if fear wasn't making this decision for me?" That question became his compass. One evening, he walked through a crowded street. He noticed how many people were moving through life with invisible battles. A man was arguing on the phone. A woman was staring silently at her screen. A young person stood alone at a bus stop. Everyone looked ordinary. But Nikit wondered how many of them were carrying dreams they were too afraid to pursue. How many were waiting for permission? How many were afraid of judgment? How many were choosing comfort because uncertainty felt dangerous? He realized that fear didn't always create dramatic destruction. Sometimes fear simply made life smaller. One avoided conversation. One postponed decision. One opportunity rejected. One dream delayed. Then another. Then another. Until a person could live an entire life without ever realizing how much of it had been shaped by fear. Nikit didn't want that life. But there was a deeper fear waiting for him. The fear of uncertainty. Because facing judgment was one thing. Moving forward without knowing what would happen was something else entirely. Chapter 3. Walking without a map. There are two kinds of uncertainty. The first kind is temporary. You don't know the answer yet. You don't know what will happen next. But you believe eventually you will understand. The second kind is deeper. You make a decision without any guarantee. You step forward without knowing whether the path will work. You act without certainty. And this was when Nikit struggled most. He wanted guarantees. Before making a decision, he wanted to know the outcome. Before taking a risk, he wanted proof it would succeed. Before changing direction, he wanted certainty that the new path would be better. But life rarely offered guarantees. One evening, Nikit met an older man named Prakash at a quiet tea stall. They had spoken several times before. Prakash was the kind of person who listened more than he talked. Nikit shared his frustration. "I keep waiting until I feel certain." Prakash smiled. "Certain about what?" "About whether I'm making the right decision." Prakash stirred his tea. "And if certainty never comes?" Nikit didn't answer. Prakash looked at him. "Then you will spend your life waiting for a feeling that life may never give you." Nikit looked down. "So how do you know?" "You don't." The answer surprised him. "You don't know?" "No." Prakash smiled. "You learn. You adjust. You continue." Nikit thought about it. Prakash continued. "People think courage means knowing you will win." He paused. "Real courage often means accepting that you may not." That sentence stayed with Nikit. He realized that he had been trying to eliminate uncertainty before taking action. But uncertainty was not a problem to eliminate. It was part of the journey. The next day, Nikit made a new rule. He would stop demanding certainty. Instead, he would look for the next reasonable step. Not the entire path. Just the next step. That idea changed his behavior. When he didn't know what to do, he asked, "What is one useful thing I can do today?" When he felt overwhelmed, he asked, "What is the next step?" When his mind tried to predict 10 different futures, he returned to the present. One step, then another, then another. He discovered something fascinating. Fear loved the future. Fear constantly created scenes that hadn't happened. It showed him rejection, failure, embarrassment, loss, disaster. But action lived in the present. The present was much smaller. You could handle one phone call, one conversation, one decision, one uncomfortable moment, 1 hour, one step. The future was enormous. The present was manageable. That became one of Nikit's most important practices. Whenever fear became overwhelming, he returned to what was actually happening. Not what might happen. What was happening now. Months passed. Nikit became calmer. Not fearless. Calmer. There was still anxiety before difficult moments. There were still nights when his mind created imaginary disasters. But now he knew what to do. He didn't argue with every thought. He didn't need to prove that every fear was wrong. He simply asked, is this fear protecting me from real danger or protecting me from discomfort? That question was powerful. Because real danger deserves caution. But discomfort deserves courage. If a situation was genuinely unsafe, Nikit respected it. But if the danger was simply embarrassment, uncertainty, rejection, or temporary failure, he learned not to treat it like an emergency. Still, one fear remained, and it was stronger than all the others. The fear of losing control. Nikit wanted to control outcomes. He wanted people to behave predictably. He wanted plans to work. He wanted effort to guarantee results. But life had never promised that. And eventually, life reminded him. Something unexpected happened. An important plan he had spent months preparing for suddenly changed. The circumstances were outside his control. At first, Nikit panicked. His mind immediately began searching for someone to blame. Then it searched for a way to reverse the situation. Then it created dozens of possible disasters. But after a few minutes, Nikit remembered something. He could not control what had happened, but he could control what happened next. He took a breath. He wrote 2 columns in his notebook. On the left, not in my control. On the right, in my control. The left side filled quickly. Other people's decisions, unexpected events, the past, opinions, timing, outcomes. The right side was smaller. His response, his effort, his attitude, his next action, his boundaries, his attention. Nikit stared at the 2 columns. The answer was obvious. He had spent too much energy trying to control the left side. From that day, he began focusing on the right. And something strange happened. The less he demanded control over everything, the more control he felt over himself. That was the beginning of a deeper kind of freedom. But mastery of fear was not simply about controlling thoughts. There was one final battle. A battle against the fear of failure. Because sometimes the thing standing between you and your next chapter is not fear of losing. It is fear of discovering what losing would teach you. Chapter 4. The day Nikit failed. The failure came on an ordinary morning. There was no dramatic music, no warning, no sign from the universe. Just a message. The plan Nikit had worked hard on had not worked. The result was disappointing. For a few minutes, he stared at the screen. Then he felt it. That old voice. I told you. You shouldn't have tried. You weren't ready. You made the wrong decision. Nikit closed his eyes. This was exactly the moment his old self would have retreated. He would have used failure as proof that fear had been right. But this time, he did something different. He allowed himself to feel disappointed. He didn't pretend it didn't hurt. He didn't force fake positivity. He simply refused to turn failure into identity. There was a difference between, this didn't work, and, I can't make things work. One described an event. The other created an identity. Nikit chose the first. He opened his notebook. At the top, he wrote, what did this teach me? Then he began writing. What did I miss? What could I have prepared better? What assumption was wrong? What was outside my control? What can I change next time? The questions transformed the experience. Failure stopped being a verdict. It became feedback. That was when Nikit understood another truth about fear. Fear often becomes strongest when failure feels final. But most failures are not final. They are moments, events, information, directions. Sometimes they tell you to improve. Sometimes they tell you to change direction. Sometimes they tell you that something you wanted wasn't right for you. But failure does not automatically mean your life is over. It means something happened. And now you have a choice. You can hide from the lesson. Or you can use it. Nikit decided to use it. The next few weeks were difficult. He had moments of doubt. He questioned himself. He felt embarrassed. But he continued, not because he suddenly became fearless, because he stopped requiring fearlessness before action. This distinction became central to his life. He no longer waited to feel brave. He acted while feeling nervous. He no longer waited for confidence. He built confidence through repetition. He no longer demanded certainty. He accepted that uncertainty was part of being alive. And slowly, fear began changing its role. Before, fear had been the driver. Then it became a passenger. Sometimes it still spoke. But Nikit no longer handed it the steering wheel. One evening, he returned to the same window where everything had begun. Rain was falling again. The city lights reflected on the wet roads. Nikit opened his old notebook. He read the first page. What am I actually afraid of? He smiled. The fears were still there, but they no longer looked as enormous. Failure, judgment, rejection, uncertainty, loss of control, not being good enough. He realized something. Mastery had never meant making those fears disappear. Mastery meant refusing to let them decide his life. He thought about the word mastery. It didn't mean domination. It meant relationship, understanding, awareness, choice. A person who understands fear can listen to it without obeying it. Fear can say, be careful, and you can respond, I will. Fear can say, this is uncertain, and you can respond, I know. Fear can say, you might fail, and you can respond, that's possible. But then you can add, I'm still moving. That was the difference. Nikit had spent years trying to convince himself that everything would be okay. Now he understood something more powerful. Everything might not always be okay. Plans might fail. People might leave. Some opportunities might disappear. Some decisions might be wrong. There would be disappointment. There would be uncertainty. There would be pain. But none of those things automatically meant he had to abandon himself. That was real courage. Not believing that nothing bad would happen. Believing that if something difficult happened, you could meet it. Nikit had finally stopped asking, how can I guarantee that nothing will go wrong? Now he asked, if something goes wrong, who will I choose to become? That question gave him strength. Because the future could not be controlled. But character could be built. And there was still one final lesson. The deepest fear was not always fear of failure. Sometimes it was fear of living fully. Because once you stop using fear as an excuse, you become responsible for the life you create. And that responsibility can be frightening. Chapter 5. The Life on the Other Side of Fear. 1 year after the night Nikit had written his first fear list, he returned to the same tea stall where he had once spoken with Prakash. Prakash was sitting at his usual table. He looked at Nikit and smiled. You look different. Nikit laughed. I still get afraid. Prakash nodded. Good. Nikit looked surprised. Good? Yes. Why? Because if you stop feeling fear completely, you may stop noticing what matters. Nikit thought about that. Prakash continued. Fear is not always your enemy. Sometimes it tells you that something matters. That sentence completed something inside Nikit. For years, he had wanted fear to disappear. Now he understood that the goal was different. Fear could be a signal, but it didn't have to be a command. It could tell him, this matters. This is unfamiliar. This could hurt. This could change your life. And then Nikit could decide. He looked back at the road. People were moving everywhere. A child was holding his father's hand. Someone was rushing to catch a bus. Two friends were laughing. A person sat alone with a cup of tea. Life was happening. Messy, uncertain, beautiful, uncontrollable. Nikit realized that fear had made him believe life needed to be safe before it could be lived. But life was never going to be completely safe. The question was not, how do I create a life without fear? The question was, how do I create a life that is bigger than my fear? That was the question that changed everything. Nikit started making decisions based on values instead of avoidance. He asked, what matters to me? Who do I want to become? What kind of person do I want to be when life becomes difficult? What would I regret never attempting? What conversations have I been avoiding? What dream keeps returning to my mind? What uncomfortable step am I postponing? He didn't answer all of them immediately, but he started asking. And sometimes, asking the right question is the beginning of transformation. He discovered that courage was not one giant decision. It was a collection of small choices. Speaking honestly, starting again, admitting a mistake, walking away from something unhealthy, trying something unfamiliar, accepting rejection, setting a boundary, taking responsibility, asking for help, saying yes, saying no, showing up, trying again. Each action was small, but together they changed his identity. Nikit no longer saw himself as someone who needed to defeat fear. He saw himself as someone who could move with fear, and that difference was enormous. There was another realization. Sometimes we think courage belongs only to extraordinary people. People who jump from planes. People who stand on stages. People who face dramatic challenges. But courage often looks ordinary. It can look like a person finally making a difficult phone call. A parent admitting they were wrong. A young person beginning again after failure. Someone walking away from constant approval. Someone choosing honesty over comfort. Someone pursuing a meaningful goal even when nobody guarantees success. Courage can be quiet. Nobody may applaud it. Nobody may even notice. But your life notices. Every time you act despite fear, you send a message to yourself. I can trust myself. And self-trust changes everything. Because when you trust yourself, uncertainty becomes less terrifying. You no longer need to know exactly what will happen. You know that whatever happens, you will respond. That was Nikit's greatest transformation. He didn't become fearless. He became trustworthy to himself. One evening, he opened his notebook one final time. On the first page was the old list. Failure, judgment, rejection, uncertainty, loss of control, not being good enough. Below it, he wrote a new list. Things I can control. My attention, my actions, my response, my honesty, my effort, my willingness to learn, my courage to begin again. He looked at the page for a long time. Then he wrote one final sentence. Fear can walk beside me, but it does not choose my destination. Nikit closed the notebook. He stood up. Outside, the road continued into the night. He didn't know exactly where it would lead. And for the first time, he was okay with that, because mastery of fear was never about knowing the future. It was about becoming strong enough to face it. Maybe you're listening to this right now because there is something you have been avoiding. Maybe it is a decision, a conversation, a dream, a change, a beginning. Or maybe it is simply the fear that you're not good enough. If that's you, remember Nikit's journey. You don't have to defeat every fear today. You don't have to become fearless. You don't need perfect confidence. You don't need a guarantee. You only need the courage to take the next honest step. When your mind says, what if I fail? Ask, what if I learn? When it says, what will people think? Ask, what will I think of myself if I never try? When it says, I'm not ready. Ask, what can I learn by beginning? When it says, I don't know what will happen. Say, I don't need to know everything. I only need to take the next step. Because fear becomes powerful when you treat it like a prophecy. It becomes smaller when you treat it like information. And perhaps the greatest form of courage is not standing without fear. Perhaps it is standing with fear and choosing your direction anyway. Your fear may never completely disappear, but your life doesn't have to become smaller because of it. There is a world beyond your comfort zone. There are conversations you haven't had, experiences you haven't lived, lessons you haven't learned, versions of yourself you haven't met. And maybe the door to that life is not locked. Maybe you have simply been standing in front of it, waiting to feel fearless enough to open it. So today, don't ask yourself, how do I stop being afraid? Ask, what would I do if fear wasn't making the decision? Then take one step. Just one. Because sometimes one courageous step doesn't change your entire life immediately, but it changes the direction of your life. And direction changes everything. If this story made you look at your own fears differently, don't let the feeling disappear the moment this video ends. Choose one small thing you've been avoiding. One call, one conversation, one decision, one beginning, and take that step. Not because you are fearless, but because your future deserves more than a life controlled by fear. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Mindset HubTube for more powerful, cinematic stories inspired by life-changing ideas and books. And if someone in your life is struggling with fear right now, share this video with them. Maybe these few minutes are exactly what they need to hear today. Remember, fear can walk beside you, but it does not have to choose your destination. This is Mindset HubTube. Keep learning, keep growing, and most importantly, keep moving forward.